With your permission, colleagues, I have a few questions of my own. I'm taken by the word that you use to describe the very complex pathways to entry and permanency for caregivers. You called it a cacophony. As far as I know, there are 5 or 6 concurrent pilots running. I couldn't make out which strain I would fit into. If you were in the driving seat, what changes would you make to the caregiver program?
One of the changes that I would make is to do away with pilot programs, first of all, because even the best of immigration lawyers that I know who work in the immigration space are starting to get really confused as to which programs apply. Um, there was supposedly the one-time program, or in its iteration, the two-time program, the interim pathway for caregivers. This was sometime in 2019. The vision for that temporary program was to clear the backlog for the live-in caregiver program, for the caregiver program, for the caring for those with high medical needs and caring for children. So I think I've identified 4 programs. That was supposed to clean it up, but it didn't. And they tried to do it twice. And I think the weakness for that particular program was it was only open for a very short window period. Try to imagine yourself as a caregiver who works, let's say, in King City, where in Ontario, where public transit is not exactly the best. Um, and your only time off is Sunday. And as that happens, you don't actually have access to public transit on Sunday. Um, and you're going to try to head down to downtown Toronto to do your language test. And because you're besaddled with a lot of work during the weekdays, you can't really prepare yourself to do your language test. And keep in mind that the program is only open for about a month and a half, twice. So it doesn't really give this person a lot of time to prepare, a lot of time to actually pass this exam that would have qualified him or her to a pathway to permanent residence. I think if I were in the driver's seat, I would do a robust reopening of the interim pathway to clear the backlog. And in conjunction, I would learn from the lessons and the mistakes of all programs in the last 10 years, including the programs under former Prime Minister Harper, for example, the caring for people with high medical needs, caring for children, and the Trudeau pilots, which are the current home care program and those for children. Try to learn the lessons from those programs. And one of the big takeaways, I think, is the removal of the LMIA requirement, which removes a lot of the stress on the foreign worker. Also, the removal of being employer specific. This is one of those programs that IRCC had that is occupation specific. So they can switch employers. So long as they stay within their occupation, they're fine. And it prevents a lot of abuses. So that's a huge positive that should be carried over to the next program. What I would probably not carry over are uh, the stringent measures that they've undertaken, and I understand where they're coming from, why they put forward where they upfronted the requirements for permanent residence, because they want to prevent the heartbreak. But IRCC and the government also needs to understand that there are needs from Canadian families for care, for example. So perhaps um, acknowledging that not all caregivers have the intention of actually staying in Canada anyway. I mean, that's probably a small percentage, a very, very small percentage, but it is still a thing that does happen. I have spoken to caregivers who have no intention to actually remain in Canada. Very rare, but they do exist. So perhaps going back to the drawing board about front loading the PR requirements could be one of the things that could be reviewed in a new program, and that goes hand in hand. And that if that goes hand in hand with the reimplementation of an interim pathway, that should clear up the backlog, and that should
Okay.
address a lot of the needs for our Canadian families requiring care.
So you would like to go back to the original two-step program where live-in caregivers came, worked for a certain time, proved their XYZ, and then applied for permanency. That was the old program, and the numbers were small, but it worked well.
I think there's merit to talking about it, but there's also merit to talking about keeping the positive aspects of front loading the
Mm-hmm.
permanent residence aspect of the program. Because at the end of the day, let's not kid ourselves. A lot of these caregivers do want to become permanent residents, and it is a given and definite pathway that's lasted for almost 100 years now. So um, being honest about it is critical, but at the same time, there has to be a balancing of interests here in a sense that we do need to provide an avenue for Canadian families to hire caregivers in the interim while this program is being worked out.
You talked about language tests.
Mm.
Could you please inform us about the cost of the language tests every time a
Right.
caregiver or a temporary foreign worker has to review their visa? What does it entail?
So, a language test costs anywhere between 250 to 350 Canadian dollars. And I've known of caregivers who have taken these tests 5 to 10 times just to get the right scores that they need. Um, that is in the order of $3,500. And that's usually a month's worth of salary if we're using Ontario's minimum wage as the standard here. So it is a very heavy burden that they have to undertake. Um, what is interesting is when they do apply, there are certain credentials that are already required from them when they apply for their work permit, and one of this is a language assessment, also an interview. My understanding of the requirement for a language test is that so that they can integrate well into Canadian society, which to me poses a big question. They're already in Canada. They're functioning members of the Canadian economy. So why is it that there seems to be a preoccupation on uh, obtaining a 5 out of 10 score for a particular test? There's also no. There's also no. Um, I should say there's also an underutilization of accommodation when it comes to disabilities, for example, for those who are taking the test. I've had clients in the past who have possible learning disabilities, for example, or who have severe test taking anxiety. That you talk to them and you know that they have functional English or French. However, they don't perform well when they're being tested. So um, privatizing, sorry, privatizing this portion of the discretion of an officer to interview should be reviewed. One analog I can think of is under the Citizenship Act is that a citizenship judge can actually interview an
Mm.
applicant if they have problems passing the test, for example. If at all, sometimes in certain situations it could be waived. For example, people who are over 55 are no longer required to take the citizenship test. Why is it that we can't do something similar for caregivers?